That janitor couldn't tame a rocking horse, let alone a wild Mustang. That was the joke echoing through the stables of Silvercrest Equestrian Center, a quiet, sprawling facility nestled just beyond the town of Heartland. A place where million-dollar horses pranced under crystal chandeliers, and names like Whitfield and Reeves carried more weight than most families' entire bank accounts. But when a battered man with a crooked back and hands worn from years of sweeping stepped forward and said 5 simple words, "I'll take the bet, sir," everything stopped. The bet itself had been little more than a sarcastic challenge. Alexander Whitfield, the silver-haired patriarch of the estate and former show champion, had offered $5,000 to anyone who could make the new wild Mustang rideable in 30 days. The stallion had been shipped in from Thunder Basin, courtesy of a Bureau of Land Management partnership meant to promote the potential of adopted wild horses. On paper, it was meant to be a good-faith PR project. In practice, it was a catastrophe. The Mustang, jet black and massive, had injured 3 handlers within the first 72 hours of his arrival, kicked one clean in the chest, bit another. The third, Jenkins, was still in the hospital with a broken wrist and a concussion. Marcus Reeves, Silvercrest's head trainer, had declared the horse a liability. Too wild, he'd said, born for the hills, not for halters. Whitfield, fuming at the failure, had made his offer aloud in frustration, expecting no takers. $5,000 if someone could break the beast, not through force, but gentling. No whips, no ropes, just make him rideable. "Show me it's possible," he said, half mocking, half challenging. "Anyone brave or stupid enough to try?" Then Ray Dawson, the janitor who'd silently pushed his broom through the aisles of Silvercrest for 7 unnoticed years, raised his head. He didn't speak often, didn't join staff lunches, didn't linger in conversations. He was a ghost of a man, moving with practiced silence, eyes always lowered, a pair of frayed gloves in his back pocket. Most folks knew his name, if at all, from the embroidered patch on his faded coveralls. They didn't know where he came from, didn't know what he did before he arrived, didn't even know if he had a home beyond the maintenance shed tucked behind the lower barn. He just showed up every day, swept the floors, filled the water buckets, cleaned the tack room, and disappeared before nightfall. So when he said, "I'll take the bet," it wasn't just shocking, it was laughable. Marcus laughed first, a sharp barking sound that cut through the murmurs. Then others joined in, not maliciously, but out of sheer disbelief. The janitor, the man who hadn't been on a horse since who knows when, he was going to tame the devil horse? Even Whitfield seemed momentarily thrown off balance. "You?" he asked, almost amused. "You've been listening in, Dawson?" Ray nodded. "He's not mean, just scared." Marcus scoffed. "He nearly took Jenkins' arm off, and you think he's scared? He's feral." But Ray didn't look at Marcus. He looked out past the group to the isolated paddock behind the barn, where the stallion was pacing with sharp, restless steps. There was something about the way the animal moved, tight, coiled, ears flicking like radar, that seemed to echo something deep in Ray's posture, as if they both carried a tension just beneath the surface, something broken, something unspoken. Whitfield squinted at him. "You've got opinions, Dawson. Fine, let's make it official. You get 30 days. You make him rideable, without force, without breaking his spirit. You walk away with $5,000. Then, with a slow, calculating grin, he added, "But if you fail, you walk away with nothing. No severance, no job. That broom of yours finds a new home. We clear?" Ray didn't flinch. "One condition. I do it my way. No one interferes." The pause that followed was electric. This man, this janitor, was standing toe-to-toe with the wealthiest man in town, in front of a dozen onlookers, and laying down terms like he had nothing to lose. Maybe he didn't. Whitfield extended his hand. "Deal." The shake sealed it. The whispers exploded. Some said it was desperation. Others said insanity. A few, like young Ellie Whitfield, who had been silently watching from her saddle, said nothing at all, but their eyes lingered on Ray a little longer than before. That afternoon, Ray didn't go back to sweeping. Instead, he stood alone beside the paddock fence, watching the Mustang as storm clouds gathered behind the mountains. The horse's black coat shimmered like oil in the fading light. Their eyes met, and in that moment, two broken creatures, one man, one beast, seemed to understand the same thing. The world had given up on them both, but neither of them was finished yet. The first time Ray laid eyes on the Mustang, he stopped breathing for a full second. Not because of fear or even awe, but because something ancient stirred in him, something he hadn't felt in years. The stallion stood in the center of the isolation paddock, head held high, his black coat glistening like wet obsidian under the Colorado sun. He didn't move with the jerky panic of a wild horse newly penned. He moved like a warrior, measured, alert, every muscle wound tight beneath that gleaming hide. And in the center of his forehead, right between two sharp, watchful eyes, a white star no bigger than a thumbprint. It looked like a piece of the sky had dropped down and branded him. They called him Midnight, a name given hastily by a handler who'd seen nothing but trouble from the moment the horse stepped off the trailer. The name stuck, probably because it suited him in all the wrong ways. Black as shadow, unreadable, dangerous in the kind of way that made people want to look away, not draw closer. He'd come from Thunder Basin, part of a controversial roundup effort by the BLM. Most of the herd had already been processed and dispersed for adoption. Midnight, though, he was different. There was something about his conformation, the way he carried himself, that caught the attention of a senior officer. Maybe it was his movement, fluid and floating like smoke over the desert. Or maybe it was the fire in his eyes, the refusal to bend, that made someone think he was more than just another wild horse headed for a holding facility. Silver Crest was never supposed to be his home. It was a show barn, a place of imported European bloodlines, champagne receptions, and prestige. Mustangs had no place there. But the BLM wanted a statement horse, something that could represent the American Mustang as more than a rescue case, a symbol. Alexander Whitfield agreed to take him on, partly for the publicity, partly for the potential prize if he could be trained for sport. Marcus Reeves hated the idea from the beginning. "These horses don't belong here," he'd said. "They're untouchable, especially stallions, especially one that's already drawn blood." Ray didn't see untouchable. He saw a creature cornered. Midnight wasn't aggressive in the way most thought. He didn't charge randomly or strike without reason. No, his aggression was targeted, calculated. He lashed out when approached too quickly, or when ropes were thrown, or when someone looked him in the eye like they were issuing a challenge. He was smart, too smart maybe, and he didn't trust anyone. He paced his enclosure constantly, as though searching for the edge of a cage that didn't yet exist. But when Ray watched him, he saw every twitch of the ears, every flick of the tail, every tight bunch step for what it really was: defense. The horse was bracing against a world that had already taken everything from him: freedom, familiarity, herd. He had no language left but fear. Ray knew that language fluently. As the staff continued to whisper about the bet, the Mustang, and the Janitor's sudden rise to local legend, Ray began observing Midnight quietly from a distance. No tools, no feed bucket, no expectations, just presence. He came every morning, sitting outside the paddock with a thermos of coffee and a battered old Louis L'Amour paperback, worn so thin the pages practically turned themselves. He didn't look at the horse directly. He just read aloud, slow and steady, letting his voice carry on the breeze. He didn't know if Midnight understood the words, of course he didn't, but animals understood tone, cadence, energy, and Ray's energy was always the same: calm, consistent, non-threatening. If nothing else, that consistency would become familiar. After the third morning of reading, something changed. Midnight stopped pacing, not for long, just a moment, but he paused, ears flicked sideways, toward the sound. Ray kept reading. He didn't comment, didn't look up, didn't adjust his rhythm, just turned another page, voice soft as the wind. That night, he came back again. this time with something new, an old guitar, beat up and restrung more times than he could count. He didn't play songs so much as he let the strings speak, simple chords, slow and melodic. As the sky darkened and the staff cleared out, Ray played with a kind of reverence. And Midnight, for the first time, didn't retreat to the farthest corner. Instead, he stood, watching, listening. Ray didn't talk to him like a trainer talks to a horse. He talked like a man talks to someone who's been through the same hell. "They don't get it," he murmured once, after a song ended. "They think you're broken, dangerous. They don't see you're just tired of fighting, of not being understood." The Mustang didn't move, didn't bolt, just watched with those deep, unreadable eyes. The next morning, the staff had started taking notice, not just because the horse was calmer, but because Ray, silent, invisible Ray, had become the center of something they couldn't explain. Sarah Cooper, the assistant manager, had started leaving an extra apple in the break room. Ellie brought out a blanket for Ray when she noticed him shivering one morning before dawn. Even Marcus, though still dismissive, began watching from a distance. He hated the attention, hated the idea that the man with no credentials was succeeding where 3 professionals had failed. But part of him was also deeply, bitterly curious. What was this man doing that made the devil horse stand still? By the end of the first week, the pacing stopped completely. Midnight still flinched at sudden movement, still pinned his ears when approached too directly, but when Ray showed up, he came to the fence. Not close, not reaching out, but he came. That was more than anyone else had managed, and Ray knew what it meant. Not submission, recognition, the kind of moment that made you believe some things, some beings, were never wild, only waiting for someone who spoke the same unspoken language. Ray never called himself a horse whisperer, never claimed to be anything but a janitor with a long memory and a heavy heart. But in Midnight, he'd found something no one else had. Not a challenge to be conquered, but a soul worth waiting for. And that was the difference that changed everything. The third morning dawned colder than the last, with a sharp wind blowing down from the mountains that cut straight through coats and gloves. The kind of wind that made horses nervous, skittish, harder to predict. But Ray showed up the same way he had every day since the bet began. Quiet, steady, carrying his thermos and a cloth sack tucked under his arm. By the time the first riders arrived at Silver Crest, he was already seated beside the paddock, his breath curling in misty clouds as he read from his book. Midnight stood near the far corner, not pacing, but watching, head high, nostrils flaring, ears alert but no longer pinned flat. There was no visible sign of progress to the casual observer, but Ray saw it in the subtleties, the way Midnight's hooves stayed planted instead of shifting with tension, the way his breathing had slowed, the way his muscles, once coiled like springs, now looked merely taut. From across the paddock, Marcus Reeves was watching too. He'd arrived early, clearly not for his usual duties, but to observe the so-called janitor method that had quickly become the subject of gossip across the stables. He stood just outside the fence line, arms crossed, jaw tight with restrained skepticism. The sight of Ray calmly sitting on an overturned bucket, reading to a horse that had nearly broken his assistant's ribs, clearly tested the limits of his patience. He didn't speak right away, just watched, until the moment Ray closed his book and took out the apple from his bag. Ray bit into the fruit with deliberate slowness, the sound of the crunch carrying across the quiet yard. Midnight's ears twitched, his body stiffening slightly as his head turned. Ray didn't look at him. He just sat, chewing casually, as if nothing about this situation was strange at all. When the apple was halfway eaten, he stood and walked, slowly, predictably, toward the fence. He placed the remaining half on the top rail, stepped back to his bucket and sat down again. Midnight didn't move, not at first. For nearly 10 minutes, the stallion stood like a statue, his ears flicked forward, then back. His eyes remained locked on the fruit. His front hoof pawed once, then twice, at the ground. Ray remained still, unmoving, not a word spoken. Then Midnight stepped forward. One step, then two, cautious, purposeful. The apple still sat on the rail. Another step, and then, like it was the most natural thing in the world, he reached forward, snatched the fruit in his teeth, and retreated. Not at a run, not in panic, but with a deliberate turn, as though accepting a gift he didn't know he wanted. From behind, Marcus scoffed. "So what now? Gonna teach him to do your taxes next?" Ray didn't rise to the bait. He just looked over his shoulder with that same unreadable calm. "Good morning, Mr. Reeves." Marcus stepped forward. "This your training method? Story time and snacks? That horse nearly killed a man, and you're feeding him apples like it's a petting zoo." "He's learning to trust," Ray replied, eyes returning to Midnight. "That's the first step." "He doesn't need trust," Marcus snapped. "He needs structure, pressure, boundaries. This isn't a therapy session, it's training." Ray gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "There's more than one kind of training, Mr. Reeves. Yours is about control, mine's about conversation." Marcus moved closer, voice dropping as if the lowered tone could disguise the hostility. "Let me tell you something, Dawson. You might have fooled the rest of them with your quiet act, but I've seen your type before. Retired rodeo hands, washed-up trainers who couldn't cut it, playing horse whisperer until something goes wrong. And it will. It always does." Ray stood slowly, not in anger, but in that same quiet strength that made shouting feel irrelevant. "You think what you want," he said, brushing dust from his knees. "But this isn't a show. This is a living creature who's been ripped from everything he knows. Your methods might work for horses bred in barns, but he was born wild. He didn't ask for this, and he's not broken." Midnight snorted from behind him, ears flicking at the tension in the air. Ray's eyes softened immediately, and he turned back, taking a few steps closer to the paddock rail. "You're all right, boy," he murmured. "Just words, nothing sharp." Marcus shook his head and turned to leave, but not before throwing one last jab over his shoulder. "When you fail, and you will, just remember that you're the one who asked for this." Ray didn't respond. Instead, he turned back toward the horse. Midnight had not retreated. In fact, he was now standing closer to the fence than he ever had before, watching Ray with those dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. That small detail, standing his ground, meant more than any trick or performance. Later that afternoon, Ray was cleaning the tack room when Ellie arrived, still in her riding boots, cheeks flushed from the chill. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "I saw what happened this morning with the apple." Ray glanced over his shoulder. "Small step." "It looked like more than that," she said, pushing herself off the frame and stepping inside. "He didn't spook. He didn't lash out. He chose to come closer." Ray nodded. "That's what matters. Choice. Choice." Ellie hesitated before asking, "Why are you really doing this?" Ray didn't answer right away. Instead, he finished polishing the leather saddle in his hands before setting it on the rack. Then he turned, wiping his fingers on a cloth. "Some people are born into second chances," he said quietly. "Others earn them. Me? I figure maybe if I help him find his way, I'll find a bit of mine too." Ellie didn't fully understand, but she didn't press. "Can I help?" Ray paused. "Not yet. He needs consistency. One voice, one face. Too many people, too many cues. It just muddies the water." Ellie nodded, clearly disappointed, but trying not to show it. "Maybe later?" Ray gave her a rare smile. "Maybe later." That evening, as the sun dipped low and cast golden light across the paddocks, Ray returned with his guitar. Midnight was already near the fence, as though waiting. Ray didn't speak, didn't play immediately. He just sat and let the silence settle, like dust on a quiet room. Then, slowly, he began strumming a melody. Not anything complicated, just the soft rise and fall of notes, like a lullaby for a world that never sleeps. Midnight lowered his head, exhaled through his nostrils, and closed his eyes. And for the first time, Ray felt the shift, not in the horse, but in himself. This wasn't about winning a bet anymore. This wasn't about $5,000 or pride or proving anyone wrong. This was about healing. For both of them. By the time the fourth day arrived, the whispers around Silvercrest had grown louder. Staff who once ignored the janitor now made excuses to linger near the isolation paddock. Riders paused during lessons to sneak glances through the slats in the fence. And Alexander Whitfield, ever the businessman and strategist, watched with narrowed eyes from his office window. There was something happening out there, something no one could explain, but everyone could feel. A wild stallion, once dismissed as untrainable, now stood at the edge of change, and at the center of it all was Ray Dawson, the man no one had ever bothered to look at twice. That morning, Ray arrived earlier than usual, his steps as steady as ever, but his thoughts weighted with a new kind of focus. He brought no book this time, no guitar, just a soft bristled grooming brush tucked into his coat pocket and a small thermos of coffee in his hand. Midnight greeted him from the far end of the paddock with a toss of his head, a sharp snort of breath misting into the cold morning air. There was no fear in his stance, not anymore, just caution, curiosity, that silent, calculating intelligence that Ray had come to respect. Ray entered the paddock slowly, deliberately. He didn't move toward the horse. He never did. Instead, he sat cross-legged in the sandy soil, placed the brush beside him, and began talking. Not commands, not even requests, just his voice, calm and low, sharing simple things. The weather, the smell of rain on the wind, the way the mountain shadows stretched longer each day as spring tiptoed closer. He talked about wildflowers that would bloom soon, blanketing the hills in purple and gold. He told stories that didn't matter except for the way they filled the space between man and beast with something gentle, something familiar. Midnight stood still for a long while, ears twitching, head angled just slightly. Listening, watching, not tense, simply present. After half an hour, Ray picked up the brush, not to approach, not yet, but to demonstrate. He ran it along his sleeve, the bristles making a soft, rhythmic sound against the fabric. He brushed his arm, his leg, narrating the motion with calm explanation, letting the sound and sight become part of the horse's understanding. Then, carefully, he placed the brush on the ground between them and leaned back on his hands. He didn't move again. He didn't need to. Midnight approached 10 minutes later, one step at a time, slow, controlled. His nostrils flared as he drew in Ray's scent. Then he stopped just shy of the brush, lowered his head, and nudged it with his muzzle. Ray didn't react, not with motion, just a quiet, "Good boy," barely above a whisper. That afternoon, as the sun warmed the barn walls and the usual hum of voices and hooves filled the stable yard, Sarah Cooper found Ray in the tack room. She leaned against the doorway with a furrowed brow, arms crossed over her vest. "Marcus is pushing back," she said without preamble. "Says you're stalling, that you're avoiding real training. He wants to bring in ropes, lunges, halters. I overheard him talking to Alexander. He's arguing that your approach isn't showing measurable progress." Ray didn't look up from the saddle he was oiling. His voice was quiet but firm. "We agreed on a month. 1 week isn't enough for trust. Rushing now would undo everything." Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I told him that. Alexander's giving you some rope, but Marcus is getting louder." Ray paused in his polishing. "Then I'll give him something measurable." By evening, Ray returned to the paddock with the same routine, but this time he carried a shift in energy. Not urgency, not pressure, just quiet intention. He brought the brush again. Midnight approached sooner than before, ears forward, eyes calm. Ray spoke in that same steady tone, brushing his own sleeve again before placing the brush gently on the ground. Midnight didn't hesitate this time. He walked directly to it, nosed it once, then looked at Ray. Ray didn't reach for it. He reached for nothing, but Midnight stepped closer. For the first time, the stallion closed the space on his own. Ray slowly lifted his hand, inches away, then closer, then contact, not pressure, just fingertips brushing over the velvety skin beneath Midnight's jaw. The horse tensed but didn't flinch. His breath huffed out, a warm cloud against the cold air, and his ears flicked back, then forward again. Ray held still, and then, in that silent understanding, something broke. Not in the horse, in Ray, because for the first time in years he felt something other than regret and isolation. He felt seen, not by people, but by a creature who understood what it meant to live on the edge of fight or flight. Who knew what it meant to be removed from your world and expected to adapt? Who carried his scars inside and out? As Ray stood slowly and turned to leave, he felt the eyes of more than one person watching. Ellie from the shadows near the tack room, Marcus from the barn entrance, and Alexander from the upper window, arms folded as if weighing the balance between pride and possibility. And back in the paddock, Midnight watched too, not with fear, not with dominance, but with recognition. The first brush of trust had been given, and for both man and horse there would be no turning back. By the fifth morning, word had spread so far through the Silver Crest Equestrian Center that even the boarders who barely spoke to the staff were asking questions. Rumors were flying. Some called Ray a washed-up trainer with a shadowy past. Others whispered he was some kind of horse psychic. But no matter the theory, everyone agreed on one thing. Something extraordinary was happening between the Janitor and the Mustang, and Marcus Reeves didn't like it, not one bit. Ray had started his morning the same way he always did, with quiet steps, an apple in his coat pocket, and no intention of proving anything to anyone but the horse. Midnight now greeted him with ears pricked and nostrils flared, but not in alarm. The wild tension that once crackled off the stallion's body had softened, replaced by an alert curiosity that made his presence feel less like a threat and more like a challenge to be earned. Ray knew better than to rush. He let the moment stretch. He let the silence speak first. Today, he brought something new, a rope halter, not to use, but to show. He held it like a fragile object in his hands, letting the sunlight catch the curve of it. He sat just inside the paddock, a few feet from Midnight, and laid the halter on the ground between them like an offering. No pressure, no expectations, just possibility. Midnight eyed the new object with suspicion at first, pacing a slow arc around it while Ray sat cross-legged in the sand, humming tunelessly under his breath. The stallion didn't touch it, but he didn't retreat either. That was enough for now. Back at the barn, Marcus paced like a caged animal. He stormed into Alexander's office with a stack of paperwork and a forced calm that barely masked his frustration. "We need to accelerate this, sir. Dawson's made some progress, yes, but it's not sustainable. That horse isn't rideable, not even haltered. This bet of yours—" Alexander looked up from his laptop with a single raised brow that silenced the tirade midstream. "The bet still has 3 weeks left, Marcus. And from what I've seen, the horse isn't the only one adapting. Dawson's methods are unorthodox, but they're yielding results. Results that your team couldn't get with force." Marcus bristled. "Sir, I have over 20 years of experience. I've trained Grand Prix winners, dressage champions. You're really putting your faith in a janitor with no credentials?" Alexander removed his glasses slowly. "No credentials we know of. Yet his results are undeniable. And let's not forget, it was your approach that landed Jenkins in the hospital." Marcus flinched. "That was an accident. And this," Alexander replied, folding his hands on the desk, "is not. This is deliberate, strategic, and perhaps most importantly, it's gaining attention. Have you seen the latest inquiries? We've had 2 regional papers call to ask about the Mustang miracle. If this continues, Silvercrest could be on the map for more than just show horses." That stung. Marcus turned without a word and walked out, his footsteps tight and clipped. Down the corridor he passed Sarah Cooper, who paused long enough to make eye contact and say one word. "Jealousy's a bad look, Marcus." She didn't wait for his response. Later that afternoon, Ellie returned from school and made a beeline for the paddock, where she found Ray sitting with his back against the fence, watching Midnight graze a few yards away. She carried a small notepad filled with scribbles and diagrams. "I did what you said," she announced, holding it out. "Sat for an hour, watched everything, wrote down his patterns, his habits. He stretches before rolling. He always circles twice before lying down. And he hates that muddy patch near the south corner, avoids it every time." Ray flipped through the pages, nodding as he read. "You've got an eye for it," he said, handing the notebook back. "Most people don't see those things. They watch the horse, but they don't listen." Ellie beamed, then crouched beside him. "When do I get to help more directly? I mean, actually interact with him?" Ray studied her for a long moment. He saw the eagerness, but more importantly, he saw the restraint. She didn't push. She didn't beg. She asked, but she waited. That, to Ray, meant more than talent. "Soon," he said finally. "Trust has to stretch between 2 points. Right now, it's just me and him. But you're getting close." That evening, something shifted. Ray brought his guitar again, and as he began to play, Midnight didn't stay at the far end of the paddock. He walked forward. Not a tentative shuffle, not the hesitant step of a skittish colt, but a calm, curious approach. He stood just 5 feet from Ray, ears flicking at the sound of the chords, eyes half-lidded with something that looked dangerously close to peace. Ray didn't look directly at him. He just kept playing, letting the music create a bridge. After a while, he set the guitar down and reached slowly for the brush, holding it in one open hand. Midnight moved closer. Ray didn't reach. He waited. And when the horse finally lowered his head and allowed the brush to graze against his shoulder, Ray whispered, "That's it. Nothing to fear." Across the paddock, Sarah stood quietly with Alexander, both of them watching from the shadows near the barn. "He's doing it," she said softly. Alexander didn't reply. He just watched with eyes sharp as glass and whispered more to himself than anyone else. "And proving everything I thought I knew wrong." Inside the paddock, Ray continued brushing, slow and methodical, as Midnight relaxed beneath his hand. It wasn't just grooming. It wasn't even training. It was communion, a fragile, powerful thing that couldn't be taught in books or seminars. It had to be lived, and both man and horse, though from wildly different worlds, had lived enough pain to understand what real trust demanded. When Ray left the paddock that night, Midnight followed him to the gate and stood watching long after the latch had clicked shut. A silent sentinel, no longer retreating, no longer wild with fear. Something sacred had begun, and neither of them was willing to let it break. By the 6th morning, a quiet electricity pulsed through the air at Silver Crest, the kind of charged stillness that precedes a storm or a revelation. Even the horses seemed aware of it, more alert, more watchful. Staff moved about their duties with hushed curiosity, finding reasons to pass by the isolation paddock more than usual. Something had shifted since the previous night, though no one could quite put their finger on it. Perhaps it was the way Midnight now stood when Ray entered. Head high, posture relaxed, not like a prisoner watching his captor, but like an equal acknowledging an old friend. Or maybe it was the ripple effect spreading through the facility, a growing awareness that the janitor wasn't just winning a bet, he was reshaping how they understood connection, control, and what it truly meant to lead. That morning, Ray didn't sit outside the paddock. He walked directly to the gate and entered with calm purpose, carrying only a soft rope looped over one arm and a brush tucked in his back pocket. Midnight didn't back away. Instead, he stepped forward, one deliberate hoof at a time, closing the space between them with a confidence that had only existed in the shadows before. Ray didn't move to touch him right away. He waited, letting the horse initiate contact. When the muzzle brushed his shirt lightly, almost like a question, Ray responded with a gentle stroke across Midnight's shoulder. The moment held steady. No flinch, no startle, only the rhythmic rise and fall of breath shared between two living things who had long since stopped fearing each other. It was mid-morning when Alexander arrived at the paddock, accompanied by Marcus, whose jaw was set with tension, barely hidden behind a professional mask. A few handlers and junior riders followed at a distance, pretending to be focused on chores, but their eyes never left the fence line. Ray continued his routine without acknowledgement. He brushed Midnight's neck, moved slowly to his withers, and eventually ran the rope gently across the horse's back, not tying it, not asking for submission, just introducing the feel, the concept. Midnight stiffened at first, but when Ray murmured a soft reassurance, he relaxed and stood still, absorbing the new sensation like a horse deciding for himself whether this human still meant no harm. Alexander's voice broke the quiet. "Impressive progress, but proximity isn't the same as handling Dawson. You said by the end of this week you'd be able to touch him freely." Ray looked up briefly, then back to Midnight. "I am touching him," he said plainly, "and not just tolerated, accepted." Marcus stepped forward, his voice laced with skepticism. "Accepted is subjective. Training's about measurable behaviors, commands, response to pressure. A halter, a lead, anything else is sentiment." Ray didn't take the bait. "You can force a reaction, or you can earn a choice. This horse chooses me, every day now. That's worth more than a lead rope." He gently laid the rope across Midnight's back again and let it rest there. Midnight didn't flinch, didn't move away. Instead, he turned slightly and nudged Ray's shoulder with his muzzle. That subtle gesture silenced even Marcus for a beat. By mid-afternoon, the story had spread like wildfire, not just among the staff, but to some of the more curious clients. A few prominent boarders found reasons to linger longer than necessary. They stood near the paddock, coffee cups in hand, murmuring to one another while pretending not to be utterly captivated by what was unfolding. Sarah arrived just before lunch, her brow furrowed with quiet urgency. "You're not going to like this," she said under her breath. Marcus tried to initiate a session this morning, had 2 handlers with ropes and a training halter, said he had authority to test Midnight's reaction to pressure. Alexander stepped in at the last minute, shut it down. Ray didn't even look surprised. Expected him to try something. He's backed into a corner. Sarah hesitated. "This is getting political now. It's not just about the horse. People are talking. Some of the younger riders are questioning Marcus's methods out loud. That's not something that used to happen here." Ray wiped his hands on a towel and leaned against the fence, gazing out at Midnight. "It's not just the horse that's changing. It's the whole place. They're watching him learn a different way, and realizing maybe they can too." Later that day, Ellie returned from school and came straight to Ray with an idea. She carried a handmade diagram, an obstacle course of sorts, drawn in colored pencil, complete with notes about spacing, textures, and behavioral markers. "I thought maybe we could test Midnight's curiosity, not obedience, just his willingness to engage with new things, like a tarp to walk across, a bridge, some poles." Ray studied her drawing with a raised eyebrow, then a faint smile. "You been doing your homework?" She grinned. "All weekend. I even researched sensory-based challenges. It's kind of like puzzle solving for horses, right?" Ray nodded. "It's more than that. It's trust in motion." He tapped the edge of the paper. "We'll build it tomorrow. Let's give him one more night with the rope. Let him tell us he's ready." That night, Ray didn't bring his guitar. Instead, he entered the paddock just after sunset with only a lantern and the same rope he'd used earlier. Midnight greeted him with a soft whicker, and Ray murmured a greeting in return. Then, in a moment he hadn't planned, but had somehow known was coming, Ray lifted the rope gently and looped it over Midnight's neck. Not tight, not fast, just there, a presence, a suggestion. Midnight froze for a moment, processing the shift. Then, slowly, he lowered his head and exhaled, a long, steady breath that spoke volumes. Ray stepped forward, guided the rope along his withers, and gave a soft command to walk. Midnight followed. They circled the paddock once, then twice, Ray saying nothing, offering nothing but quiet encouragement and loose guidance, and Midnight followed. When they stopped, the rope slipped away without tension, and Ray ran a hand down the stallion's neck. "You did it, friend," he whispered. "You let me lead." From the shadows near the barn, Alexander watched with arms crossed. He said nothing, but the furrow in his brow suggested deep thought. He wasn't just observing a horse's transformation anymore. He was watching his entire philosophy of training unravel and be rebuilt before his eyes. Back in his apartment above the maintenance shed, Ray sat with a cup of tea cooling in his hands. He stared at the wall, not really seeing it, lost in thought. For the first time in years, he wasn't running, he wasn't hiding. The world was watching again, but this time it wasn't judgment that chased him, it was possibility. And down in the paddock, Midnight stood still under the stars, ears flicking at the breeze, head high and posture proud, not as a beast tamed, but as a creature transformed. And it was only the beginning. By the time the seventh day rolled around, the atmosphere at Silvercrest had evolved from hushed curiosity to full-blown anticipation. Everyone, from seasoned trainers to teenage riders and even a few of the more aloof clients, seemed to be waiting for something. A turning point maybe, a miracle possibly. But no one could deny that something was building, not just between Ray and the Mustang, but in the way people were beginning to question what they thought they knew about horses, about training, and about the quiet man who had swept their floors unnoticed for 7 years. That morning, Ray arrived at the isolation paddock with a halter in his hand, not the heavy leather kind favored by traditional trainers, but the soft rope halter Ellie had made under his guidance. Midnight stood near the far fence, ears twitching in the wind, posture alert but not tense. Ray didn't call him. He didn't whistle or clap. He just stood there, the halter in his hand, and waited. It took 3 minutes. That's all. 3 minutes of silence, of space, of unspoken invitation. Then Midnight turned, walked toward him in slow, measured steps, and stopped just close enough for Ray to lift the halter. The stallion dipped his head slightly, the smallest gesture of consent, and Ray slipped the rope gently into place. No struggle, no resistance. It was a moment so quiet, so intimate, that it left Ray's throat tight with emotion. Because he knew this wasn't just about gentling a wild horse. This was about trust, given freely, and that, in his experience, was the rarest thing in the world. He led Midnight slowly around the paddock, not pulling, not pushing, just guiding. The Mustang moved with cautious confidence, his hooves landing softly on the earth, ears flicking toward every sound but always returning to Ray. They didn't cover much ground, but that wasn't the point. Every step was a statement. A week ago, this animal had been feral, defensive, nearly unapproachable. Now he moved beside a man, not like a broken thing resigned to its fate, but like a partner beginning to understand his place in a new world. By mid-morning, word had spread again. It wasn't formal. There wasn't a schedule or announcement. But somehow, by the time Ray brought Midnight into the small round pen just outside the main barn, a quiet crowd had gathered. Sarah stood near the gate, arms folded, trying to look casual. Ellie leaned on the rail with a notebook in one hand and stars in her eyes. A few of the younger riders huddled together, whispering. Even Marcus appeared, standing just out of the spotlight but close enough to see every movement, every decision. Ray didn't put on a show. He didn't perform. He simply walked Midnight in, paused to let him settle, then moved through a series of simple exercises. Walk, halt, step back, turn. The commands were silent, delivered through pressure and release, body positioning, eye contact. Midnight responded with increasing clarity, his movements fluid, his eyes soft. Each time he complied, Ray's hand found his shoulder, his neck, his jaw, not as reward, but as reassurance. And the Mustang accepted the touch like a language he had once known and was now beginning to remember. After 20 minutes, Ray unclipped the lead rope and stepped back. He said nothing, made no gesture. He simply stood, and Midnight stayed, free, unbound, entirely able to walk away, but he stayed. The impact of that simple decision rippled through the crowd. You could see it in their faces, in the stunned silence, in the way even Marcus shifted uncomfortably, as if the ground beneath him had tilted. Alexander arrived just as Ray was leading Midnight back toward the paddock. The owner's sharp eyes took in the scene, the people, the horse, and the man. "Seems you've met your end-of-week promise," he said. Ray only nodded. "He's letting me handle him. Freely." "No force," Alexander noted. "No submission." "Only choice," Ray said quietly, "and a reason to keep making it." That afternoon, Ellie approached Ray with a question she'd clearly been building toward all week. "Can I work with him?" she asked. "Not just watch. Actually be part of it." Ray studied her for a moment, weighing more than just her ability. He was weighing her intent, her energy, her readiness to understand that this wasn't about tricks or tasks. It was about responsibility. "One condition," he said finally. "You let him come to you. No reaching, no grabbing. He needs to invite you." Ellie nodded, solemn and serious, and entered the paddock slowly. She held an apple in her palm, open and steady, and sat cross-legged on the ground near the center. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Midnight grazed a few yards away, casting occasional glances in her direction. Ellie didn't speak, didn't move, just waited. Then, as if making a choice he'd long been considering, Midnight turned and approached her. He sniffed her hand, took the apple with gentle lips, and stood there. Ellie didn't reach for him. She didn't need to. The connection had already been made. From the fence, Ray watched with a quiet pride that stirred something deep and painful and beautiful in his chest. He saw his daughter in that moment, not in Ellie's face, but in the fierce love of horses, the patience, the willingness to listen rather than command. That evening, Ray sat alone in his apartment, the worn folder of newspaper clippings untouched on the table beside him. He didn't open it, not yet, but he didn't turn away from it either. Tomorrow he would. Tomorrow he'd begin to face the story he had run from for 15 years. But tonight, he just let himself feel the fullness of what had happened. A wild horse had accepted him. A young girl had begun to see herself as more than a rider, as a communicator. And somewhere deep down, he felt the quiet stirrings of his old self, the one he had buried long ago. Outside, the paddock lights cast long shadows. Midnight stood near the fence, gazing toward the maintenance shed, as if waiting for one last word. Ray opened the window and whispered, "You did good, partner. You're not broken, never were." And in the stillness, a low, contented nicker drifted back across the yard. The sound of trust, the sound of healing, the sound of a beginning that no one, especially not Ray, had seen coming. The next morning began with a strange stillness, the kind that usually comes just before a storm, though there wasn't a cloud in the sky. At Silver Crest, the sun rose warm over dew-covered paddocks, but the quiet buzz that had grown over the past week was absent. Something had shifted. Ray felt it the moment he stepped out of his apartment and made his way toward the stables. His boots crunched on the gravel, his breath steady, but his instincts were alert. Midnight's paddock was empty. For a moment, his heart lurched. Then he spotted the note, pinned crookedly to the wooden post by a thumbtack. "Moved to training ring for assessment, MR." The initials made his stomach tighten. Marcus Reeves. It wasn't just a change in location. It was an ambush. Ray broke into a stride, faster than he'd moved in years, weaving through the stable paths toward the outdoor ring. From a distance, he heard the unmistakable crack of a lunge whip and the sharp clatter of hooves on compacted dirt. He knew before he even reached the gate what he would see. Midnight, wild-eyed and sweating, was being driven around the ring in tight, panicked circles. Marcus stood at the center, whip in one hand, lead rope in the other, barking orders to Trevor Wilson, who was trying to corner the Mustang with nervous energy. Midnight was confused, agitated, and above all, afraid. His ears pinned back, nostrils flaring, his hooves slipped slightly on the turns, his movements frantic and uneven. "What are you doing?" Ray's voice cut across the arena, sharp as a blade. Marcus didn't look at him right away. "Assessment," he said flatly, "the kind a real trainer would perform after 3 weeks. We had a deal." Ray climbed through the side gate without waiting for permission. Marcus finally turned to face him, his tone dismissive. "Mr. Whitfield is out of town. Left last night. I'm not going to let this horse be paraded like some petting zoo curiosity. He needs proper training, real structure, and today he gets it." "This isn't structure, this is fear," Ray shot back. "You're not training, you're breaking." "Same thing in the end," Marcus muttered, but even his voice carried a hint of unease now. Midnight was panting heavily, flanks heaving, his black coat darkened with sweat. Ray could see it clearly. The stallion was near his tipping point. One more crack of the whip, one more minute of that pressure, and something inside the animal would shatter, not just his confidence, but his core. Ray stepped into the ring. Trevor hesitated, eyes flicking toward Marcus. "You sure?" "Back off," Ray ordered quietly, and for reasons he didn't quite understand, Trevor obeyed. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but Ray's presence, calm but immovable, made it clear that any further confrontation would no longer be verbal. Ray raised his hand, not to strike, not to gesture, but to still the air. His body language softened. He bent slightly at the waist, signaling deference, non-threat. Midnight slowed, his steps faltering. He recognized him. Even through the fog of fear, the horse knew this man was different. Ray didn't move forward. He waited. A full minute passed in absolute silence before Midnight lowered his head an inch. Then another, and another. His breathing began to slow. "That," Ray said without turning to Marcus, "is how you lead a horse out of panic. Not with force, with presence." The spectators had gathered again. Word always spread fast in a place like Silver Crest. Sarah stood at the rail, arms crossed, eyes stormy. Ellie, hands clenched in white fists at her sides, had the kind of outrage only teenagers could hold without restraint. Even Gerald Watson, one of the wealthier clients, had stopped by, now watching with furrowed brow. What had begun as an aggressive reassertion of control by Marcus had turned into a public humiliation. Ray walked slowly to Midnight, murmuring quietly as he approached, palms facing the ground, movements as deliberate as breathing. Midnight stood still, sides still heaving slightly, but posture no longer defensive. When Ray reached him, he placed a hand on the Mustang's shoulder, stroking lightly, grounding him. The entire arena was still. Marcus cleared his throat. "You can't argue this method works," Ray said softly, "not for Marcus's benefit, but for the horse's. But it only works for those who are willing to let go of ego." Marcus muttered something about showmanship and stormed off, Trevor following with uncertain steps. Ray stayed in the arena for another half hour, working slowly with Midnight. Nothing ambitious, just reassurance, basic exercises, and space. Then he led him back to the paddock. When they reached the gate, Ellie met them with red-rimmed eyes. "That was disgusting," she said, "the way they treated him." Ray didn't respond right away. He removed the halter and let Midnight free into the paddock before speaking. "It's not the first time someone's tried to control something they didn't understand. Won't be the last. They tried to undo everything you've worked for," she said, her voice trembling. "And still," he said, gesturing to Midnight, who had wandered over to the hay bale and begun to graze, "we're here. We're whole. That's the difference between fear and trust. Fear breaks quickly. Trust endures." Later that evening, after the stables had quieted, Sarah found Ray outside the barn, rinsing the sweat from his arms at the spigot. "We need to talk," she said quietly. He looked up, and the concern in her face told him she wasn't here to discuss feed schedules. She handed him a folder, not thick, but dense with weight. "Marcus left this in Alexander's office, probably meant for Monday. I got there first." Ray opened it. It was all there, everything he had tried to bury. Newspaper clippings, the accident, the inquiry, the photos of a smiling girl on a champion jumper. Emma. He didn't say anything for a long time. "You know," Sarah began hesitantly, "I never understood why someone like you was just sweeping floors, but I figured maybe you needed the silence. After today, I think it's more than that. I think you were hiding." Ray closed the folder. "You'd be right." "What are you going to do?" Ray looked toward Midnight's paddock. The horse stood still, calm beneath the twilight sky, his silhouette dark against the fading gold. "I'm going to finish what I started." Sarah nodded. "For what it's worth, I'm on your side. And Marcus, he's not finished trying. Be ready." Ray gave a tired smile. "I've been running for 15 years. Maybe it's time to stop." That night, he placed the folder beside the old shoebox under his bed, the one with Emma's ribbons and the photo that used to sit on his desk at Golden Vista. He didn't open it. Not yet. But now he knew it wasn't just about the past. It was about what came next. Not survival, redemption. Outside, Midnight let out a soft nicker from his paddock. Ray didn't need to look. He heard it for what it was. Reassurance. A horse's way of saying, "I'm still here." And this time, so was he. The morning after the confrontation with Marcus brought a change in the air that was subtle but undeniable. Word of what had happened in the training arena had traveled fast. Staff and riders who had once whispered about the odd janitor reading to a wild Mustang were now speaking his name with something closer to respect. Even those who still harbored doubts couldn't ignore the evidence of their eyes. Midnight had not only calmed but progressed. He followed Ray without lead ropes now, moved in sync with him like they'd been working together for years. And though Ray didn't care for attention, he felt the shift, the way people paused longer as they passed, the way silence fell whenever he entered a room. He had become the unintentional center of something he never asked for and could no longer avoid. Ellie appeared by his side just after breakfast, practically vibrating with purpose, a halter looped over one arm and her notebook under the other. "I've been thinking about something," she said, without preamble, "about how to build on what we did yesterday." Ray raised an eyebrow, waiting. He already associates the halter with something positive. But what if we start introducing guidance? Not pressure, not pulling, just direction. Light taps, sound cues, markers. Give him choice, but help him understand what we're asking. Ray studied her, weighing the suggestion. It wasn't just a good idea. It was intuitive, subtle, aligned perfectly with how Midnight had responded to every new challenge. "Show me," he said, and Ellie lit up. Together, they walked to the paddock, where Midnight was already alert, ears swiveling toward the gate. He whinnied low, a sound that made Ellie grin from ear to ear. "He likes me," she whispered, more to herself than to Ray. "Then earn it," Ray replied, handing her the halter. She moved with the caution he'd taught her. No sudden movements, no direct eye contact, offering her presence instead of demanding it. Midnight approached her on his own, sniffing the halter, then bumping it lightly with his muzzle as if inviting the next step. With practiced ease, Ellie slipped it over his head and secured it. Ray watched every muscle in Midnight's body, waiting for signs of tension, but they never came. If anything, the Mustang seemed eager, as if he too sensed a new chapter beginning. They led him to the center ring, the one Marcus had used for aggression, and turned it into something else entirely. No whips, no shouting. Just Ellie's soft voice, Ray's quiet instruction, and Midnight's growing confidence. They began with cones, leading Midnight in wide circles, gently shifting his path with minimal contact, rewarding him with calm praise and occasional slices of apple. Then they introduced ground poles, the kind show horses trotted over for agility and rhythm. At first, Midnight stepped around them. Then, with Ellie walking ahead and Ray slightly behind, he began to step over, one hoof at a time, measured and thoughtful, never rushed. "He watches you when you move," Ellie noted, "like he's reading your intentions." "He is," Ray said. "That's how horses think. They don't listen to words. They listen to energy, posture, the space between movements. You speak before you even open your mouth." Midday heat shimmered across the fields, but neither of them noticed. They worked for hours, introducing small variations, pausing between obstacles, walking backward a few steps, stopping at the sound of a click. Every time, Midnight responded, not perfectly, but with intent. Each mistake was followed by a recovery. Each hesitation eventually led to trust. When Ray finally called a break, Ellie collapsed on a hay bale, flushed and grinning. "That was incredible," she said. "It's like he's learning faster than we can plan." Ray sat beside her, drinking from his thermos. "That's the part most people miss. Horses don't just learn from you. They learn you. They watch, test, adapt. Most trainers just want compliance, but when a horse is thinking with you, there's nothing like it." Ellie hesitated, then said, "He's not just learning, he's changing. The way he looks at you, the way he moves, he trusts you more than anyone." Ray didn't answer. He was watching Midnight, who stood in the shade, breathing calmly, as if the past weeks had shed a lifetime of fear. The Mustang wasn't broken, he was whole. That afternoon, Sarah found Ray by the tack room, cleaning bridles with his usual quiet efficiency. "Maria Len called again," she said, leaning on the doorframe. "She and Tommy want to come tomorrow, not just for a visit this time. She's bringing paperwork. She's serious about the therapy program." Ray set down the bridle, wiping his hands. "Midnight's ready, mostly. She wants you too." Ray froze. She said, and I quote, "There's something in his way, not just the horse, him too, like they're healing each other." Ray let the silence sit before speaking. "And Marcus?" Still fuming, but quieter. "Maybe yesterday shook him a little." "He'll come back harder." Sarah nodded. "Probably, but you're not the janitor anymore, Ray. You're the man who's turned a wild Mustang into a therapy prospect in less than a month. People are watching, and more than that, some of them are learning." That night, Ray sat in the paddock with Midnight again, the guitar resting on his knee, his fingers plucking a melody that drifted on the breeze. Midnight stood just a few feet away, head lowered, eyes half closed, in a state of deep calm. Ellie had gone home. Sarah had locked up. The ranch had quieted, leaving only the hum of insects and the distant whinny of a restless foal. Ray didn't sing. He never did. But the music was enough. As he played, a thought he'd buried for years rose slowly to the surface. Not guilt, not regret, but something new, hope. Not just for the horse, for himself, for what he might still become, not despite the past, but because of it. For the first time in 15 years, Ray didn't dread what tomorrow might bring. He was ready to face it. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one who needed saving. Maybe the horse had saved him too. The final day of the bet arrived with a strange stillness that blanketed Silverest like fog before a storm. It wasn't silence, far from it. Hooves clattered, bridles jangled, and voices rose in their usual morning cadence. But beneath it all was an undercurrent of tension, anticipation, something unspoken in every glance sent toward the isolation paddock. Staff members who once dismissed the old janitor now stood straighter when he passed, watching with a respect they never would have offered just weeks earlier. Ellie arrived early, ponytail bouncing, notebook under one arm, and nervous energy trailing behind her like a scent. Ray was already there, as always, leaning on the paddock rail, staring at the horse who had changed everything. Midnight stood calm, collected, almost regal. The Mustang that had once tried to climb walls and tear through steel fencing now moved like a dancer in rehearsal, balanced, aware, sensitive, but unafraid. Ray had led him through a final set of exercises at sunrise, just the two of them, as the world turned gold and quiet. No whips, no force, just rhythm and understanding. Every movement was a conversation, every pause a chance for Midnight to choose connection over retreat. And again, he had chosen trust. Alexander Whitfield arrived mid-morning in his tailored coat and polished boots, flanked by Marcus, whose expression was a study in reluctant defeat. Wordlessly, they approached the arena, where the final demonstration was set to take place. The crowd that gathered was larger than expected, clients, staff, even curious locals who had heard rumors of the wild Mustang who'd been tamed by a janitor who didn't raise his voice. Dr. Miller was there too, clipboard in hand, and Maria Len with Tommy in his wheelchair near the front rail. Ellie took her place beside Ray, her eyes wide with equal parts nerves and pride. "You ready?" she whispered. Ray didn't look at her as he nodded. They began the session with groundwork. Midnight walked at Ray's side with no halter, no lead, just body language and trust. He responded to shifts in Ray's posture like they were cues in a ballet. A step forward, a turn, a halt. Everything mirrored. Then came the obstacles, the same ones from earlier in the month, now rearranged in more complex patterns. Midnight tackled them without hesitation, pausing at Ray's subtle request, backing up through narrow spaces, walking across tarps and wooden bridges like he'd been doing it for years. Ellie narrated softly, explaining the importance of voluntary engagement, the difference between compliance and cooperation. Her voice was steady, informed, passionate. Ray said little, but his presence spoke louder than any commentary. The Mustang's transformation was undeniable. When Ellie stepped forward for the final portion of the demonstration, Ray handed her the rope halter with a nod. She fitted it on with gentle fingers and led Midnight through a series of cues they had been practicing in secret. Simple at first, then more advanced. Lateral movement, yielding to pressure, walking with a light touch on the neck rather than the halter. Midnight responded to her as he had to Ray, not with perfect precision, but with the unmistakable willingness that only came from trust freely given. The crowd applauded as they finished, a ripple of surprised approval that spread like wildfire. Ray removed the halter and stepped back, allowing Midnight to move freely. Instead of bolting or panicking, the Mustang trotted once around the ring, tail lifted in a flourish, then returned to Ray and stood beside him without being asked. The gesture was quiet, but electric, not just obedience, devotion. Alexander approached slowly, his eyes unreadable. "Well, Dawson," he said, voice carrying just enough volume to silence the remaining chatter, "I believe that settles it. You've won the bet." There was a flicker of pride in the man's expression, something reluctant but genuine. $5,000 as agreed, but I suspect that's not the only thing you've earned. Ray accepted the check without looking at it. His gaze stayed on Midnight, who stood watching him, ears forward, body loose. "Money was never the point," Ray said. "He just needed a chance to decide for himself." "Seems he did," Alexander agreed, then added, "I meant what I said last week. The offer stands. Permanent position. Rehabilitation specialist. Full authority over special cases." Ray hesitated, then turned to Ellie. She was beaming, her hands clasped together in hope. "And the girl?" he asked. "She stays," Alexander said without pause. "Apprentice status, official. I assume that's what you'd want." Ray nodded once. "Then I accept." The announcement caused a stir in the crowd, and more than a few surprised murmurs echoed across the arena. Marcus stood stiffly at Alexander's side, jaw clenched. Ray approached him next, extending a hand. "Not trying to replace you," he said simply. "Just add something different." Marcus looked at the hand, then finally took it in a brief, tight grip. "Long as we're clear," he said, "I still don't agree with everything you've done, but I can't argue with the result." "No need to agree," Ray replied. "Just need to listen." That afternoon, Maria pulled Ray aside near the stables. Tommy was playing with Midnight under Ellie's supervision, the boys' laughter carrying across the fields like wind chimes. "I'm happy for you," she said. "Silverus needs what you bring, but if you ever change your mind—" She held out a card. "Healing Hooves will always have a place for you." Ray accepted the card with a smile. "Appreciate that, but I think I'm right where I need to be." The sun dipped low behind the paddocks, casting long golden streaks across the dusty ground. Ray walked the perimeter of the ranch alone, thinking. The past had finally caught up to him. His name, his story, the tragedy that had shaped him. But it hadn't swallowed him. He was still standing, and more than that, he was rebuilding. He visited Midnight one last time before turning in. The Mustang lifted his head and walked to the gate, resting his chin against Ray's shoulder in a gesture that was neither wild nor trained, just true. Ray stood there for a long time, saying nothing, letting the silence speak for them both. "Sleep well, old soul," he murmured, patting the Mustang's neck. "Tomorrow we start something new." And for the first time in a long, long time, Ray Dawson walked away from the paddock not as the janitor, not as the ghost of a man once broken by grief, but as the person he was always meant to be, the teacher, the horseman, the one who never gave up.